In the previous video, I introduced an editing technique that I call the black reflection technique, and its purpose is to put you in full control of how a gradient is suppressed, when, and where. But as the technique has created some confusion, I thought it would be a good idea to take a moment and try to clarify some things. The first thing to clarify is the technique does not involve simply raising the black point. If only it were that easy to suppress a gradient, we'd all be doing it. In Affinity Photo, right center is the histogram presently for this image. And if you know how to read a histogram, you can see in that histogram that there is a lot of room on the bottom left side to raise the black point. There's simply no information there, so it's not going to get rid of the gradient if we raise it. What we are doing in the black reflection technique is creating a black plate and then applying one of Affinity Photo's many composite methods, in this case the reflection composite or blend mode. In the most technical sense, what it does is reflect the color of the plates in which that composite is active down into the layer below it. It introduces more black into the layer below. However, it does not do this in a linear fashion. A black plate will work much more strongly on objects of dark luminosity. And since gradients are typically less luminous than the subjects that we are shooting, it has an effect much like averaging out the gradient, pulling it toward black. Nor is this technique simply like compressing the low side of the light curve into darkness, because it doesn't help us much. All it does is pull down the lower luminosity, essentially darkening the gradient but still leaving it there to affect the image. We'll demonstrate here by opening up a Shadows and Highlights tool and pulling the shadow side all the way down to the negative. Unless your monitor is poor, you should still see that there is a clearly distinguished gradient in this image, red on the left, green on the right. Let's go ahead and get rid of that tool. And this time, we'll try something a little more direct with the Curves tool. This time, we'll pull down the light curve on the lower side and even try increasing the black point by moving the lower left of the curve to the beginning of the information. As before, we can darken the gradient this way, but we can't get rid of it. And even if we pull down the lower side of the light curve into a compressed C, all we end up doing is darkening the gradient. And since we have to pull that curve way down, we lose information in our subject matter. And loss of information is absolutely not what we want. Let's take a moment and talk about what we do want, or at least what I want out of this image. I want the galaxies, I want the Bodes and the Cigar Galaxy. So something that a few persons that saw the last video on how to suppress gradients this way, bemoaned was, oh dear God, you lost the integrated flux nebula, the IFN. The IFN is not my target here. It's not my subject of interest. The galaxies are my subject of interest. If I was composing a shot for the IFN, I would shoot this whole thing differently. There's this trend, I believe, these days in astrophotography, this idea that every image must show everything possible. And I don't know about you folks, but I took a lot of art classes back in my university days, and that's like a violation of everything in me that was ever trained in composition. When I create an image, I want to emphasize the subject matter and de-emphasize the other matter, or at least draw the eye away from it. If you feel an overwhelming need to put everything possible in every image you shoot, be my guest. But I'm not going to do things that way. And it's just not how good images are made, not the kind of images I can sell. So, with that said, there's also the simple fact that it was the first clear nights after weeks of bad weather, and I had not quite 6 hours between the two nights, about 2 or 3 hours each night to shoot this. And with an 81mm telescope, it's just not enough time to even capture the IFN, presuming I had wanted it. So for those that have been complaining you lost the integrated flux nebula, it's not there. Or if there is any trace of it, it's lost underneath that much, much, much brighter gradient created by the nearby and very bright full moon. So, back to reality. Hopefully at this point it's clear that you can't just crank up the black point, nor draw down the light curve with a Shadows Highlights tool or a Curves tool. It's basically different iterations of the same tool. Dealing with the powerful gradient just is not so simple as that. To get rid of the gradient, we're going to have to pick a method to suppress it. PixInsight offers some useful tools. They're okay in their time. I don't feel they're so useful now. Graxpert is a great tool that's free, and it does a pretty good job. I think it does a better job than the stuff we find native to PixInsight. With all of that said, every single tool that you use comes with a price, and I don't mean money. What DBE and PixInsight, Graxpert, and AstroFlat Pro do, behind the scenes where you don't see, is essentially create and composite in plates to suppress what they think is gradient. Because there is more automation involved in their processes, you have less control of the outcome. Maybe you get a good outcome, maybe you don't. But you will lose information if you go about removing a gradient with those tools. Even Graxpert, which has pretty impressive AI at this point, ultimately works by suppressing a certain amount of saturation and luminosity. And because it actually changes that information that you were working with, the original information on the image that you shot before running whatever gradient removal tool you use, that's destroyed. In other words, it's not there on the plates anymore. You can't bring it back. You can attempt to restore it to the image, but you can't draw it back out of the image. That data is no longer there. I much prefer non-destructive editing. Non-destructive editing refers to editing that does not destroy your source material, or I guess you could say, doesn't permanently pull the data out of it. That way, if later on in the editing process, I see a use for some of that data, I can put it back into the image, as you'll see as we go through this. So having established that we can't just raise the black point or pull down the light curve with a curves tool or a shadows highlights tool, and successfully get rid of such bad gradients as we see in this image, we're going to go ahead and introduce the black reflection plate now. That's just a pixel layer that's painted all black. A shortcut for putting such a layer in is, in Affinity Photo, just select the Shapes toolbar on the left and draw a rectangle over the layers. Make sure your rectangle is under the stars. We don't want to affect the stars with this technique, just the layer with the nebulosity or galaxies and the gradients on it. Once I've drawn the black plates over the lower layers, I like to shape it to the size of the image. That way I'm not wasting memory and there's less information for the computer to have to process while going about the demanding process of editing images that are hundreds of megabytes in size. And then, with the black plate layer selected, we're going to choose the reflection blend mode or composite, essentially reflecting the black down into the layer with the galaxies below it. So at this point, we've pretty much done exactly what we did in the previous video using the same subject. Let's begin exploring why we might want to consider using this technique over a destructive method such as Graxpert or other more traditional gradient removal tools. It all begins with understanding that all of our information is retained. We can pull up or wipe out any information, we can experiment with the results in any number of ways, and we can bring back into the image or suppress just as much information as we want to. At this point, we can see that a little bit of the gradients remains, even after running our black reflection plate. I don't know if YouTube compression will allow you to see it, but it remains in the original image as red on the left and green on the right. We could probably crush that gradient out of the image by killing the saturation. So, with the Vibrance and Saturation tool opened up, let's crank the saturation all to 0, making the image black and white. Now, I haven't fully crushed the gradient, but I see something very interesting here. The subject matter, the galaxies, look really good and sharp with the saturation removed. They look really good and sharp because all the information has been retained. Applying the black reflection plate was not destructive. All the information remains in the source layer. And getting the saturation out of the way really helps to bring out the sharpness. And this is why I feel that it's so important to edit non-destructively. Because if you discover that there is something in the information that might have been removed by a gradient removal tool, you can pull that information back into the image and apply it. So I'm going to export this monochrome version of our galaxies as a TIFF. And then I'm going to open up this monochrome version in PixInsight, where I'm going to run the Blur Exterminator on it. Here, Blur Exterminator can apply its amazing artificial intelligence to further sharpen Bodes and the Cigar galaxies. To avoid the creation of artifacts in the sharpening process, I'm going to turn sharpening stars all the way down to 0 since there are no stars in the image to sharpen. We're just working with the starless plate here. And I'm going to tell Blur Exterminator to only work on the luminance channel. And a moment later, we get this. Later on, when it's time, we can introduce this plate back into the image, adding this refined sharpness to our final image. And we can do this because with non-destructive layer-based editing, all the source information remains. We can pull it out and work with it in any way at any time. Back in Affinity Photo, with our stars layer turned off, let's try a little experiment. Some person said they thought space should be brighter, and that space isn't naturally black. I disagree. I live in a Border 1 region, and during a moonless night, I cannot see my hands in front of my face. And I think the idea that space is not supposed to be black might come because so many people these days are shooting through a haze of light pollution. Or perhaps it's simply just we have to offset our cameras to minimize the appearance of certain kinds of noise in the final image. Or maybe it's an aesthetic choice. But space is non-reflective, so unless there is subject matter in the background, space is black. For those interested, there is a link about this in the description. It goes to an article where it describes how an astronomer measured the darkness of space and found it to be magnitude -6.5, about 0.3% the brightness of the full moon. And even then, to record that brightness, it has to reflect or refract off something or be provided by an emitter such as ionized hydrogen or a star. In the absence of both, or in short exposure images, space is going to be black. And if you live in a place where there is no light pollution and there are no street lights or urban lights to deal with at all, the land in the sky between the stars is so dark you can't see your hand, and that's reality. Alright, enough of that. If you do have a preference for brighter space for any reason whatsoever, you can moderate the opacity of the black reflection plate. Just go to the opacity slider, center right, and punch in a number, scroll your mouse over the number box, or simply drag the slider left or right and see if you like the outcomes. In my case, I don't care for any outcome other than about 100% because I want to kill that gradient. I don't like gradients, I want it gone. However, even with the black reflection plate, we have some lingering red on the left and green on the right. I'm going to kill this just like I did last time. I'm going to apply a shadows and highlights tool and a luminosity range mask. Let's start with the luminosity range mask. We'll put the range mask tool in the background layer. That's where the galaxies and the gradients are. That way the luminosity range mask only affects the background and the galaxies. And we're going to drag down the left side of the mask, which on the darkest side of the light curve is going to limit how much light can pass. The goal once again is to drag down enough of it to suppress the gradient, while minimizing impacts to the galaxies. Notice as we pull down the luminosity range mask that the background isn't simply turning black, it's disappearing. It restricts the passage of all light below a certain brightness, so we have to be very conservative with the range mask. I'm going to put the stars back on. It might help give a clearer perspective of the effects of the range mask. And with the star layer back on, we can more clearly see the black and green gradient. We'll pull the range mask down just enough to further dim out that gradient. And then we'll raise the range mask at the luminosity values of the galaxies to preserve all their information. I want the detail of the arms. Hopefully YouTube will allow that to show. It's very clearly on my photo editing monitor, and I want to save the detail to be found in the cigar galaxy. Once again, one of the key points here to bear in mind though is I can control that range mask. I can pull it down as much or as little as I want, adjusting just how much gradient suppression I want and in what way. Now I've gone ahead and thrown in the shadows and highlights tool, and I find that dragging down the shadows and highlights all the way is the only thing that really fully finishes suppressing the gradient. If I don't drag it down all the way, we will retain a little bit of light in the background. Unfortunately, that light is heavily tainted by the gradient, and all photography edits have a cost. If I retain some of that background lightness, the cost is retaining the gradient with them. The price I choose to pay is suppressing the gradients entirely. You may have different tastes and want to retain more or less of the background and gradient. This method allows you to customize exactly how and what you suppress. Now I'm going to continue applying the power of non-destructive editing. Remember how we were able to bring back so much sharpness in the monochrome rendition of the galaxies? Well, I'm going to draw that monochrome layer back into the image now and place it under the stars. The image is monochrome. The reason it might look like there's a bit of color in it right now is because Star Exterminator captured some of the nebulosity within Bode's galaxy, and it shows in the star plate. Now, what I want to do is find the best composites or blend mode to add the nicely sharpened detail in the monochrome version of the galaxies back into the color images of the Bodes and cigar galaxies. In Affinity Photo, I can easily check out the results of each and every possible composite or blend mode just by passing my mouse over it. For now, I decided on the hard light mode. It's not a blend mode I use much, but it was great for retaining the razor sharp detail in the monochrome galaxies and adding it to the color versions below. Let's take a look and see what that looks like in the cigar galaxy. The result is pretty darn good, and the detail that we have preserved in the cigar galaxy is impressive, which also brings up another point. Contrary to what, I don't know, the naysayers, the haters, whatever you want to call them of this method are saying, that this method pulls detail, this is not just simply cranking down the light curve or cranking up the black point. Compositing is a different beast altogether. And the detail's there. We have a lot of it now, and we're going to pull even more of it back, which we can do because this form of editing is non-destructive. All the information is still there. It has not been destroyed by any step in the editing process. It is there and waiting for if we choose to pull it back into the final image. Now at this point we have, I guess what you could say is the potential for more detail in the image. I want to bring it out and refine it in both the Bodes and the cigar galaxies. One way I'm going to do this is to try to find the best compromise in opacity between the monochrome layer and the color layer of the galaxies below. In the end, about 38% seems to do the best job. At this point, the monochrome layer is showing us a lot of beautiful detail, especially in the arms of the Bodes galaxy and the central core nebulosity found in the cigar galaxy. Now I'm going to momentarily turn off the monochrome layer because we need to keep improving the color and detail in the color layer. We want to maximize that before we take advantage of the benefits the monochrome layer can give us. Now I'm going to very selectively bring up the reds with the particular goal of amplifying the gases erupting out of the cigar galaxy on the right. To do this, I'm going to use the picker option on the curves tool, grab the image itself right where the dim gases are, press the mouse button and begin dragging up, which will pull up the luminance of the RGB channels right at the luminous range where those dim gases are. Then I'm going to drag the upper range of the curves channel back down so that I don't blow out the brighter cores of the galaxies. Increasing one of the curves tools for the cigar galaxy has over-brightened a little bit the Bodes galaxy on the left. Because we have all the information preserved non-destructively in this image, it is possible to fully readjust the brightness of this image. I'll simply create another curves tool and drag down the light curve, just a simple C drag, until the lights in the Bodes galaxy is reduced so that we are not overblowing the core of that galaxy. And because we don't want this to affect the cigar galaxy on the right, once we have the curves tool where we want it, we'll just erase out how this particular curve affects the cigar galaxy. Alright, we have the curves tool for the left where we want it. Let's clear that effect back off the cigar galaxy. Note that we aren't adding information to the cigar galaxy. We are clearing some unwanted suppression off the galaxy so that the information that is already there can show through both the black reflection and the curves tool that we use to enhance the Bodes galaxy on the left. Now we effectively have one curves tool enhancing Bodes galaxy on the left and another curves tool enhancing the cigar on the right. Since we can now enhance the cigar without having any deleterious effects on the rest of the image, I'm going to bring up the red channel, which is simply going to enhance the red that is already there. It's not adding information, it is developing information that's already there. This is the power of working with layers. You can very selectively work with whatever single part of the image that you want. You can experiment and do so non-destructively, and you can customize each part of the editing process for whatever that individual section of the image requires. With a few deft manipulations of the master light curve and the red channel, we can bring out a great deal of detail both in the erupting nebulous gas and the structures within the galaxy, which I don't think is too bad for an 80mm doublet refractor, just using an uncooled planetary camera. Now I'm going to place a vibrant saturation tool above the color background plates of the galaxies and enhance the color across the board, being very careful not to saturation clip. Saturation clipping is such a huge issue in modern astrophotography. I don't know how this came to be. It seems that many persons seem to even feel that it's desirable. Anyway, that's a topic for another time. I can drag the vibrance all the way to the top because vibrance is a tool that automatically avoids saturation clipping, and then I'll add to the color that the vibrance brings into the image just by pulling up the saturation slider just a little, watching for any loss of detail. And the moment I see it, pull back the saturation a little bit and stop there. Now the purpose of that vibrance and saturation tool was to further enhance the nebulosity erupting from the cigar galaxy. So with the vibrance and saturation layer selected, I'll click the erase tool and erase the effect of that particular tool right out of the Bodes galaxy. The nebulous structures in the Bodes galaxy already have enough enhancement. They don't need additional help. Now I'm going to go back into the further sharpened monochrome version of the image, turn that layer back on and double check it. I can see that with the adjustments to the color layer, we now need to change the blend mode on the monochrome layer. And skimming over several of them, I can see the average mode gives us the best effect. What it does is average the sharpness into the color below it, creating what looks to be a slightly washed out but sharper image, and it's easy to add the color back into the images. Now at first, when we put the monochrome version in, it's going to look like we are going to lose detail. and that's because we need to enhance how the monochrome plate shows over the color plate when using the average composite mode. We'll start the enhancement by adding a brightness contrast tool to the monochrome plate. Then we'll increase the brightness of the monochrome plate, bringing up its contribution of sharpness and detail to the image. Then I'm going to add a vibrance plate. Drag the vibrance plate outside of the monochrome plate so that it's affecting the color plate below it. And this will add some additional vibrance and saturation. This compensates for the muting of vibrance and saturation that commonly happens with an averaging composite. This brings the colors within the Bode's galaxy and the cigar galaxy back up to where they should be. Well, more or less where they should be. The average composite had such a strong negative effect on the saturation seen in both galaxies that I wanted to add some more color, so I simply duplicated the vibrance saturation layer and adjusted the vibrance and saturation sliders till the color was once again correct. And then, noticing that the two vibrance tools have overridden the Bode's galaxy, another curves tool is opened, this time over both the monochrome and the color layer. The red channel is selected from the RGB option. Then I use the picker tool, go over to the Bode's galaxy where the troublesome red is, grab that portion of the Bode's galaxy and slide down till the red is removed from the galaxy and the color is once again balanced. Now this image is much cropped, and as anybody who crops an image knows, your stars tend to swell. They're just getting bigger along with everything else. I don't like that effect in cropped images, and it's easy enough to shrink the stars. At the very top in the star layer, I opened up a curve tool. In the RGB setting on the master channel, I grabbed the light curve at about the lower 10% and dragged it toward the right until the stars were shrunken to where I wanted them. When I felt they looked good, that part was done. That's very quick and easy. Now the key thing to bear in mind here is every step of the way, every single thing that we've done to address the gradient and the appearance of our subject galaxies can be changed. Let me show you another way to manage a gradient suppression. I'm going to drag another rectangle over the image, and this is going to become another reflection composite layer. In fact, let me just pop up to the right center and set the composites on this new layer at reflection and turn off the black reflection layer. Now we can set this new reflection layer to any color or shade of gray, and the chosen color will reflect down to the lower layer, enhancing or modifying it. But here, I simply turn the layer gray by setting the red, green, and blue channels at 20. And we'll think of this as a dark gray layer, while the black layer has the red, green, and blue channel colors set at 0. If we turn one layer on and the other off and switch between them, you can see the subtle differences in how they each affect the image. It's like adding an offset to the blacks. Now I've made the gray reflection plate a little lighter, setting the red, green, and blue channels at 50. And I like the effect of the lighter gray on the galaxies. It helps reveal the nebulosity in the galaxies and the galactic arms in the Bode's galaxy. But for my taste, it doesn't suppress the gradient enough. We can get the best of both worlds. So what I'll do is I'll just put the black reflection layer above the gray reflection layer, and then with the black reflection layer selected, I'll use my erase tool to erase out the black reflection layer directly over the galaxies. We can do this because, once again, this form of editing is non-destructive. All of the core information, all of the information from the gradients and the galaxies and the stars and everything, always is available within the image, and we can selectively exclude or bring back in just as much as we want, when we want it, and where we want it. And this, by the way, is not adding any information to the image. None of this information is artificial. All of this information is in the image. All that's happening here, very specific portions of the black reflection layer are being erased out over the galaxies so that all the information in the galaxies can show up. The only thing that has changed is now the black reflection plates is only obscuring or suppressing the gradient, while the galaxies themselves are only being controlled by the gray reflection box, which is brighter, allowing more detail, or brightness I should say, to come through from the galaxies. As you can see, it does blow out the core a little bit, especially of the Bode's galaxy, but we'll deal with that in a bit. Let's go ahead and erase out the black reflection layer from over the cigar galaxy. The erase tool, by the way, is set to reveal at about a flow of 21 and a hardness of 0, creating a nice soft brush. That way the transition between the black reflection layer and the gray reflection layer is very normal, or natural I should say. There's no harsh transition. Now for my taste, there's another step that I want to do with this image before finishing. I'm going to open up an unsharp mask, Place that layer above both the monochrome and the color layers of the galaxies, and raise the radius and factor sliders just slightly. This is going to add just a bit of sharpness to both galaxies. With a tool like this, just like with the clarity tool, we have to be very careful. Overusing it can easily lead to fragmentation of the image, which is another very common issue that I see in many astrophotography photos. I won't accept that in my images. When I compose and edit my images, I'm treating them as if I might put them up for sale. And some of these images will go up for sale. But even if I don't plan to put one up for sale, I want it to look good because I just take pride in my images. So I want the final image to be very professional. A radius of 0.4 pixels and a factor of 0.57 seems as far as we can push the unsharp mask, so I think I'm done now with the unsharp mask. Now there's just one thing left that I really want to do. Applying the gray reflection layer to the galaxies themselves has increased the brightness and allowed some of the detail to show through even better. But, especially with the Bode's galaxy, the core is somewhat blown out. I want to fix this. I'm going to start with the Curves tool and drop the brightness in the Cigar galaxy to bring back the detail that we want. However, it's not going to work as efficient change on the Bode's galaxy. We're going to have to take another step. As is the case with so many things in layer-based processing, there are quite literally an infinite number of ways this problem could be approached. But as we are working with non-destructive editing and I have all the data still available to me, this is what I'm going to do with it. I'm going to drop down to the lowest layer, the galaxy layer that's invisible. It is untouched and unedited. All the data, everything from the gradient to the galaxies, everything is there. I'm going to duplicate that layer and then drag the duplicated layer up above both the color and monochrome versions of the galaxies. Then I'm going to name that layer Galaxy Core Correction. And with the Galaxy Core Correction layer selected, I'll choose the Erase tool, set everything to 100%, and erase everything out of the layer except for the core of Bode's galaxy. Then I'll feather the margin of the core. Then I put a brightness tool in the core layer and slightly dimmed it, then added it back to the image. And we can do this because with non-destructive layer-based imaging, all the information is there. It's never removed in the editing process. Finally, for those who absolutely insist on brighter space, and that's cool if it's what you like, on or above your space layer, draw another reflection rectangle, and this time make it white. Then on the opacity slider, draw the opacity all the way down to 0 and slowly add back in whiteness until you have the black offset to where you want it. And either before or after you change that whiteness, change the composite or blend mode of the white reflection layer to average. That way the whiteness will not wash out any detail in the image. Whiteness will simply be added into every group of pixels, thus working like an offset, non-linearly affecting the darker spaces. Notice also when you select the average composite that you don't lose any stars in the image. All the information is still there. This is because compositing is not simply changing the black point or the white point. It is a much more sophisticated and powerful tool than that. So here we have the final image with the space offset just a little wider. About 3% of the white reflection layer has been composited back into the overall image using the average composite mode. All the detail from both galaxies has been retained, and it has been possible to further enhance that detail because this entire type of editing and gradient suppression is entirely non-destructive. At any moment, in fact, I could bring back the gradients if I wanted. All I would have to do is click off the black reflection plate, the Shadows Highlights tool, and the luminosity range mask that is suppressing it. And for the inevitable person that is going to complain that, "Dear God, you've lost signal, I can't see the IFN." Well, there's no IFN captured in this image. The exposure is not long enough. That's what happens when you're dealing with cloudy nights and you get 5.5, 6 hours of exposure, and you're making do with the conditions you have under a nearly full moon. This video is meant to portray how to salvage a broken image that had to be shot in poor conditions, and that's the beginning and end of it. And for that few who just can't stand it, that I'm not editing the way they've been taught you're supposed to edit, that I'm using alternative techniques here and they feel a need to get on here and troll and rage. I'll be honest, when people criticize my work, I want to second guess myself, so I go and I take a look at what the trolls are doing in sites like Astrobin and other places where they've posted images. I'm just going to be frank here with the trolls. I would take a sledgehammer and smash my telescope into a paperweight before I lowered myself to producing images of the quality that you seem to think is good. Not interested. So, if you find the way I do things to be that offensive, watch another channel. I'm going to keep developing differently and looking for better ways. For everybody else who are happily the vast majority, I'm sorry you had to listen to my little tirade there against the trolls. For bizarre reasons that yet elude me, astrophotography has a minority of people who they seem to have a canon in mind, this idea about how one must develop images, and they really seem to become irate at the idea of alternative forms of going about astrophotography. If you spend time on Facebook forums on astrophotography or sites like Cloudy Nights, you quickly know who they are. They're the ones who get really preachy if you happen to be using a reflector telescope. They'll start talking down to you if you're not using a monochrome camera because that's how it's got to be done. And they love to tell you exactly what software you need to be using and the exact way that you have to do it, and explain to you that going about things any other way is wrong. And well, we all know the type. I have legitimately gone back and looked at their astro bins and whatnot when they've made complaints, because I want to see if I'm doing something wrong, and pretty much without fail, the ones who come across as the loudest and the angriest produce images that I've sold a lot of images in my life, and I couldn't market their stuff, and generally full of noise, imbalanced light, poor luminosity control, poor color control, and their work is just horrible. But I don't want to focus on that. I don't want this channel to become someplace negative. What I'd rather say is thank you for watching, and thank you for being open-minded enough to entertain alternative ways of developing. The old ways we've been doing things, they're good, and they bring us a lot. But I think some innovation, some new ways of looking at things, and especially the power of layer-based processing, which allows us to non-destructively and very selectively maximize our image development capabilities, is a superb way to go. It just offers so much. So in the end, the main thing to take out of this addition to the previous video is that the black reflection technique is incredibly flexible. Nothing works for everything, but this technique can be altered heavily to accommodate most any gradients, I think. And you can alter it in any number of ways, by changing the color of the reflection plate, adding luminosity range mass, or curves, or shadow highlight tools to further adjust gradient suppression, and custom tailor where and how you want the gradient suppressed and structures to show through. If you are good with layer-based processing, the process is infinitely flexible, which makes it very unlike tools like DBE and PixInsight, or Graxpert, or even AstroFlat Pro. Because this process is non-destructive, the data, including even the gradient, is always there for you to work with later if you choose. For example, think of how removing saturation from the background plate with the galaxies on it revealed potential to greatly enhance sharpness and detail. We were then able to duplicate that as a separate plate, enhance it, and add its qualities to the final image. This is the beauty of editing with non-destructive layer-based photo editing applications, and the advantage of knowing how to do each step for yourself. The possibilities are endless, and because all the information is there, you can transform anything at any time in any way that you want. Finally, in honor of the trolls who can't stop screaming about how terrible this process is, how everybody's going to hate it, I thought I'd put up a couple recent images I shared on Facebook. See, I came up with this black reflection process months ago. I just haven't had a chance to make a video about it yet. And I've been sharing quite a lot of images made with that process. And as a rule, they're very well received. Nobody's screaming, "Dear God, you lost signal," or "That's wrong," or "That's terrible." The trolls really only turn up when you violate their fantasy canon. If you use tools or techniques that don't really fit how they've been taught one is supposed to do things. Well, that's about it. For everybody, I guess even including the trolls, thank you for watching. Now get out there and shoot the sky.